Captain Greg Martinez stood on the bridge of the Horizon's Dream and watched Earth grow larger in the viewing screen. And he smiled, because after 6 months away from home, he was finally bringing 3,000 colonists back to celebrate the Unity Festival. And the ship hummed quietly as it approached the massive orbital station that circled the blue planet like a silver ring. And his crew moved efficiently around him, checking systems and preparing for docking procedures, and everything seemed perfect on this bright morning in 2247, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Coalition for 20 years now, and life was good and peaceful and full of promise for the future. The communications officer turned to him with a confused expression and said that Luna Base was sending an emergency transmission, and Greg felt his stomach tighten because emergency transmissions were rare and usually meant something terrible had happened, and he told the officer to put it through immediately. And Admiral Lisa Berkeley's face appeared on the screen, and she looked tired and worried, and her voice was tight with tension as she spoke, and she said that a massive alien fleet had just emerged at the edge of the solar system, and they were Krell warships, and there were more than 200 of them, and Earth's defense fleet only had 47 combat vessels, and the Krell were demanding immediate surrender. Greg felt the blood drain from his face because everyone knew about the Krell, and they were a reptilian species that had conquered 12 star systems, and they were aggressive and ruthless, and they believed that might made right, and they had been expanding their empire for decades, and now they had come to Earth. And Greg looked at his crew and saw the same fear in their eyes that he felt in his heart, and he asked the Admiral what they should do, and she told him to get his ship to the orbital station as fast as possible, and to start evacuation procedures, and then her image flickered and disappeared, and Greg started giving orders, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking. The Krell fleet was moving fast, and within 2 hours they had crossed half the solar system, and President Daniel Cooper appeared on every screen across Earth and the colonies. And he stood in the emergency command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, and he looked directly into the cameras, and his voice was calm and strong, and he said that the Krell had demanded surrender, but humanity would never bow to tyranny, and he said that Earth would fight, and every colony would fight, and humanity would stand together against this threat, and he said that evacuation protocols were beginning, but the military would engage the enemy and buy time for civilians to reach safety, and his speech ended with words that would echo through history when he said that humanity had sought peace among the stars, but if the Krell wanted war, then war they would have. Admiral Berkeley gathered her fleet near Jupiter, and the 47 warships looked small compared to the Krell armada that was approaching like a dark cloud, and she knew the odds were terrible. But she also knew that every minute her fleet delayed, the enemy was another minute for civilians to evacuate, and she had fought in border skirmishes before, but never anything like this. And she opened a channel to all her ships and told her captains that today they would show the galaxy what human courage looked like. And Commander Jake Peterson and his fighter squadron checked his weapons one last time and whispered a prayer, and then the Krell fleet arrived, and the battle began. The space near Jupiter lit up with weapons fire, and human ships darted between the larger Krell vessels using speed and maneuverability to compensate for their smaller numbers. And Jake led his fighters in a desperate attack on a Krell battlecruiser, and his pilots were the best in the fleet. And they had studied Krell shield technology and found a weakness in the harmonic frequencies, and they exploited it ruthlessly, and 3 Krell battlecruisers exploded in brilliant flashes of light, and for a moment it seemed like humanity might have a chance. But then the Krell changed tactics, and instead of engaging the fleet directly, they split their forces, and a large group of warships broke away and headed straight for Earth. Admiral Berkeley screamed orders to pursue, but the Krell were too fast and too many, and her fleet was tied up fighting the main group, and she could only watch in horror as nearly 100 enemy vessels approached the blue planet and the orbital. Defense platforms opened fire, but there were too few of them, and the Krell ships had powerful shields, and they shrugged off the defensive fire like it was nothing. And then they began bombardment, and plasma weapons stabbed down through the atmosphere and struck New York and London and Tokyo and Mumbai, and the great cities of Earth burned. Greg had reached the orbital station with his ship, and he was helping evacuate people to the emergency shelters when the bombardment began. And he saw the flashes of light on Earth's surface, and he knew that millions were dying, and his wife and daughter were in New York, and he tried to call them, but the communications networks were overwhelmed, and all he could do was stand there and watch and pray. And around him people were crying and screaming, and the station shook as Krell fighters attacked it, and emergency alarms wailed like the screams of the dying planet below. War Master Throck commanded the Krell fleet from his flagship, and he watched the bombardment with satisfaction. And the humans were dying in their millions, and soon they would surrender, and the Krell Empire would claim these rich worlds. And he sent a message to Earth demanding immediate capitulation, and he waited for the response, and he was certain it would come quickly, because in his experience all species broke when their homeworlds burned, and he had conquered many planets, and this would be no different, and he allowed himself a moment of pride because this victory would cement his legacy among the Krell forever. But the response that came was not surrender, and President Cooper's face appeared on every Krell screen, and his eyes were hard, and his voice was like iron, and he said that humanity rejected the Krell demands, and he said that every human who had died in the bombardment would be avenged 1,000-fold, and he said that the Krell had made a terrible mistake because they had awoken something they did not understand, and he authorized something called Operation Righteous Fury. And then his image disappeared, and War Master Throck felt a flicker of doubt for the first time, because the human leader had not looked like someone who was beaten, and he had looked like someone who was angry. In the command center deep underground, President Cooper turned to his military leaders, and General Karen Phillips was there, and so was Dr. Alan Rivers, who ran the Advanced Weapons Research Bureau, and the president asked them if they were ready, and they both nodded. And Dr. Rivers brought up holographic displays that showed weapons and technologies that had been developed in secret for years, and things that were too dangerous to use in peacetime. But now, there was no choice. And the IDD president looked at each design and approved them all, and he said that humanity had tried to be peaceful neighbors in the galaxy. But if the Krell wanted to see what humans were really capable of, then he would show them. The bombardment continued for another hour, and when it finally stopped, 15 million humans were dead and entire cities were radioactive ruins, and the Krell fleet settled into orbit like vultures, and they waited for surrender, but it did not come, and instead something else happened, and all across Earth and Mars and Europa, and every human colony, the civilian economy began transforming, and factories that made consumer goods started making weapons, and shipyards that built pleasure cruisers started building warships, and every human who could hold a weapon volunteered to fight, and humanity was done being peaceful. And now they were going to show the galaxy what happened when you attacked their homeworld, and the sleeping giant had awakened, and the Krell were about to learn the true meaning of human fury. Jenny Morrison climbed through the rubble of what had once been a skyscraper in Manhattan, and her rescue suit was covered in dust and blood, and she could hear someone crying beneath the collapsed concrete and steel, and she called out to her team. And together they lifted a massive beam and found a family of 4 huddled in a pocket of space, and they were alive. And Jenny felt tears run down her face because after 12 hours of pulling bodies from the ruins, it felt good to find survivors, and she helped them into the rescue vehicle, and then turned back to the ruins because there were more people trapped, and she would not stop until she found them all or collapsed from exhaustion. All across Earth, similar scenes played out, and emergency workers dug through the ruins of great cities, and medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded, and the death toll climbed higher every hour, and the exact number would not be known for weeks, but everyone knew it was in the millions. And the Galactic Coalition convened an emergency session, and species from across the galaxy expressed sympathy and shock and said kind words about humanity. But when Ambassador Kyle Martinez asked them to intervene militarily, they fell silent, and one after another. They cited the Krell Empire's military strength and their own policies of non-interference, and only the Viridian Republic offered real help, and their ambassador stood beside Kyle and condemned the other species for their cowardice, but it made no difference, and the coalition would not act, and humanity stood alone. President Cooper addressed the nation again, and this time his speech was broadcast not just to humans, but to every species in the galaxy, and he thanked the Viridians for their support, and he looked directly into the camera and spoke to the coalition, members who had refused to help, and he said that humanity would remember who stood with them and who abandoned them in their darkest hour, and he said that when this was over, the galaxy would be a different place. And then he turned his attention to his own people, and he told them that the next months would be hard, and that more sacrifices would be required, but that humanity would survive and would prevail. And he ended by saying that the Krell had brought war to Earth, but humanity would bring justice to the Krell. Dr. Alan Rivers worked around the clock in his laboratory, and his team of scientists had not slept in 2 days, and they were finalizing designs for weapons that had been theoretical until now. And the first was called the Quantum Displacement Drive, and it would allow ships to make micro-jumps during combat and appear and disappear at will like ghosts. And the second was the Graviton Lance, and it created localized gravity wells that could crush enemy vessels like tin cans. And the third was the Neural Command Network, and it let pilots interface directly with their ships, and their reaction times would be faster than any biological limit. And the prototypes were ready, and production was beginning, and Rivers looked at what they had created and felt both pride and fear, because these weapons would save humanity. But they would also change warfare forever. On Mars, Governor Linda Hayes stood in the command center of the main colony and watched as mining equipment was converted to manufacture weapons, and the massive fusion reactors that had powered the terraforming operations were being redirected to fuel new shipyards, and the colonists worked with desperate energy because they knew Earth had been bombed, and they knew they could be next. And Linda received reports every hour, and production quotas were being exceeded by hundreds of percentage points, and volunteers were flooding the recruitment centers, and Mars was transforming itself into a fortress. And she sent a message to President Cooper, telling him that Mars would fight and would never surrender. And she had 3 children, and she wanted them to grow up free. Commander Sarah Blake had survived the first battle near Jupiter, and her ship was damaged but functional. And she gathered the remnants of the human fleet and began a guerrilla campaign against Krell supply lines, and she refused to engage in direct combat because the Krell still had superior numbers, but she could harass them and bleed them and make them pay for every mile they advanced. And her tactics were unconventional and aggressive, and the Krell commanders did not know how to respond because their military doctrine assumed enemies would fight honorably. And Sarah had no interest in honor, and she only cared about killing as many Krell as possible. War Master Throck grew frustrated, and he had expected surrender within days of the bombardment, but instead, the humans were fighting harder, and their resistance was actually increasing, and he did not understand it, because every species he had ever conquered had broken when their homeworld was attacked, but the humans seemed to become more determined, and it made no sense to him, and his officers reported supply problems and communication disruptions, and the guerrilla attacks were small but constant and annoying, and Throck decided that he needed to break human morale completely, and he ordered his fleet to bombard the Mars colonies. The attack on Mars came without warning, and Krell warships appeared above the red planet and opened fire, and the orbital defenses fought back, but they were overwhelmed, and plasma weapons struck the domed cities, and Governor Linda Hayes died in the first strike along with 200,000 other colonists, and the dome shattered, and the thin Martian atmosphere rushed in, and people died screaming, and the Krell bombardment lasted for 2 hours, and when it was over, Mars was a graveyard, and the Krell fleet withdrew, and War Master Throck waited for humanity to surrender, but once again he was disappointed. The attack on Mars had the opposite effect of what Throck intended, and instead of breaking human morale, it unified humanity like never before, and people who had been hesitant about total war now demanded vengeance, and production increased again, and volunteers flooded recruitment centers in such numbers that they had to be turned away, and scientists worked even harder, and the first warships equipped with the new technologies began rolling off the assembly lines, and they were sleek and deadly, and they represented everything humanity had learned about warfare in 20 years of studying alien technology, and they were crewed by volunteers from the devastated cities, and every single crew member had lost someone in the attacks. Vice Admiral Chris Hammond was given command of the new First Strike Fleet, and he stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the 25 warships under his command, and they were beautiful and terrible, and he had lost his brother in the Earth bombardment and his sister on Mars, and he wanted revenge, and his orders were simple, and he was to take his fleet and hunt the Krell and show them what human ingenuity could accomplish, and he gathered his captains and told them that today they would begin the counterattack, and every person on every ship cheered. The First Strike Fleet moved silently through the asteroid belt, and their sensors had detected a Krell supply convoy, and it was protected by a dozen warships, and Hammond ordered his ships to attack positions, and Commander Rachel Ford sat in the pilot seat of the destroyer Phoenix Strike, and the Neural Command Network connected her mind to the ship, and suddenly she could feel the vessel like it was an extension of her body, and she could react at the speed of thought, and the order came to attack. And the human ships blinked into existence around the Krell convoy using their quantum displacement drives. The Krell were completely surprised and they tried to respond, but the human ships were too fast and too maneuverable. And Rachel sent her destroyer diving between two Krell warships and fired the graviton lance and a gravity well formed in space, and crushed one enemy vessel while the other was torn apart by tidal forces. And she blinked her ship to a new position and fired again and destroyed two more Krell ships. And around her the rest of the fleet was doing the same, and the battle lasted only 15 minutes, and when it was over, the entire Krell convoy was destroyed and not a single human ship had been damaged. News of the victory spread across human space at the speed of light, and for the first time since the war began, people dared to hope. And in the ruins of New York, Jenny Morrison heard the news while she was still pulling survivors from the rubble, and she stopped and looked up at the sky and whispered a prayer of thanks and then went back to work. Because there were still people who needed saving, and all across Earth. And the colony's humans stood a little taller and worked a little harder, because now they knew they could win. War Master Throck received the reports, and at first he did not believe them because a convoy of 12 warships could not simply vanish. But the evidence was clear, and he watched the recordings from the few sensors that survived, and he saw human ships appearing and disappearing like demons, and he saw weapons that defied understanding. And he realized that he had made a terrible mistake, and the humans were not weak, and they were not broken, and they were angry, and they had technology he had never seen before. And for the first time in his long military career, War Master Throck felt fear, and he sent a message to the Krell High Command requesting reinforcements, but he suspected it was already too late. Admiral Lisa Berkeley stood in the reconstructed command center on Luna Base and studied the holographic display that showed the positions of every human and Krell ship in the solar system, and the balance had shifted, and humanity now had 70. Warships and more were being completed every day, and the new vessels were faster and better armed than anything the Krell had, and she was planning the offensive that would drive the invaders from human space forever, and her officers worked around her with focused intensity. And everyone knew that the time for defense was over, and now humanity would attack. On Earth, the rebuilding continued even as the war raged, and Colonel Peter Grant had established the Civilian Defense Corps, and he was training ordinary citizens in combat and evacuation procedures, and millions volunteered, and they learned to use weapons and to organize defenses, and the message was clear. And never again would humanity be caught unprepared, and never again would they be victims. And in every city and town, people practiced drills and built shelters, and Earth was becoming a fortress, and the Krell had intended to break human spirit, but instead they had forged it into steel. Dr. Rivers brought another innovation to the military, and his team had developed the Hellfire missile, and it used antimatter warheads, and the destructive power was almost unimaginable, and they tested it on a captured Krell battleship that had been disabled in an earlier engagement. And the missile struck the vessel, and there was a flash of light brighter than the sun. And when their sensors cleared, the battleship was simply gone, and not even debris remained. And Rivers ordered immediate mass production, and within weeks every human warship would carry these devastating weapons. War Master Throck knew his position was weakening, and the humans were growing stronger every day, and his supply lines were constantly harassed, and his fleet had lost dozens of ships to the human hit and run attacks. And he needed a decisive victory to restore Krell morale and break the human will to fight, and he studied tactical maps and made his decision. And he would lead the bulk of his fleet in a direct assault on Luna Base, and if he could destroy the shipyards and command centers there, then human resistance would collapse, and it was a desperate gambit, but he had no choice because reinforcements from the Krell homeworld would not arrive for months, and by then it might be too late. Lieutenant Commander Amy Chen worked in fleet intelligence, and she had sources throughout the Krell fleet, and one of them was a Viridian spy who had infiltrated the enemy command structure, and the spy sent a message, and it contained Throck's battle plans, and Amy immediately brought the information to Admiral Berkeley, and together they studied the enemy strategy. And Berkeley smiled for the first time in weeks, because Throck had given her exactly what she needed, and instead of reinforcing Luna, she would set a trap, and the Krell were about to learn that humans could be cunning as well as brave. The Krell fleet assembled, and more than 150 warships gathered for the assault, and War Master Throck addressed his commanders and told them that today they would crush human resistance once and for all, and his officers roared, their approval because they were confident in their numbers and their strength, and they did not know that human forces were waiting, and the fleet moved toward the moon, and as they approached, they detected only minimal defenses, and Throck thought his intelligence had been accurate and the humans had not anticipated his attack, and he ordered his ships to attack formation. The trap was sprung and suddenly human warships appeared from behind the moon and from within nearby asteroid fields, and the Krell found themselves surrounded, and Admiral Berkeley had hidden both the first and second fleets, and now they struck. With overwhelming force, and Commander Rachel Ford led her torpedo squadron straight into the heart of the Krell formation, and her pilots were the best in the fleet, and they moved with inhuman speed thanks to the neural command network, and they targeted the Krell flagship, and dozens of torpedoes struck its shields and the shields collapsed and more torpedoes punched through the armor, and War Master Throck's ship began to die. Vice Admiral Chris Hammond's forces used their quantum displacement drives to appear inside the Krell formation, and the enemy ships were designed to fight enemies who approached from outside, but the human vessels materialized in their midst and opened fire at point-blank range, and Krell warships exploded by the dozens, and the enemy formation dissolved into chaos and confusion, and individual Krell captains tried to respond, but they had no coordinated strategy, and they were being destroyed. Piecemeal. Captain Nicole Davis commanded the battlecruiser Indomitable, and her ship was equipped with the first operational graviton lance, and it was larger and more powerful than the weapons on smaller vessels, and she targeted a cluster of Krell battleships, and fired, and a massive gravity well formed in space, and the enemy vessels were pulled toward each other, and they collided, and their hulls crumpled, and then the gravity well collapsed and created a shockwave that tore apart 6 more Krell ships. And Nicole fired again and again, and each shot destroyed multiple enemy vessels, and the Krell had no defense against this weapon. War Master Throck watched his fleet die, and his flagship was crippled and fires burned throughout the ship, and half his crew was dead, and he tried to organize a retreat. But the humans had blocked every escape route, and he realized that he had been outmaneuvered and outsmarted, and he had underestimated the humans one final time. And rather than face capture, he made a decision, and he ordered his dying flagship to ram an asteroid at full speed, and the ship accelerated and struck the rock, and exploded, and War Master Throck died believing that at least his death would be honorable. With their commander dead and their fleet shattered, the remaining Krell ships surrendered or tried to flee, and Admiral Berkeley let some of them go because she wanted them to carry the message back to the Krell homeworld, and she wanted every Krell to know what happened when they attacked Earth and the Battle of Luna was over, and humanity had won its greatest victory, and the solar system was liberated. But Berkeley was not finished, and she immediately began planning the pursuit because the Krell needed to learn that humanity would not stop until justice was served. The human fleet chased the fleeing Krell across 3 star systems, and they destroyed enemy bases and freed worlds that had been conquered, and on the planet Vex Prime, Major Kevin Brooks led Marines in ground operations against Krell occupation forces, and the fighting was brutal and close quarters. But human soldiers had powered armor and advanced weapons, and they were motivated by rage and grief, and the Krell garrison surrendered after 3 days, and the native aliens of Vex Prime emerged from hiding, and they looked at the human soldiers with wonder and gratitude, and they had lived under Krell tyranny for 20 years, and now they were free. The Galactic Coalition watched in amazement as humanity transformed from victim to victor in just a few months, and species that had considered humans to be weak newcomers now viewed them with respect and fear, and some species regretted their refusal to help during Earth's darkest hour, and Ambassador Kyle Martinez used humanity's military success to reshape coalition politics, and he argued passionately that the policy of non-interference had enabled the Krell attack, and his speeches gained support from species who had long lived in fear of Krell aggression, and the political landscape of the galaxy was shifting. President Cooper proposed the Mutual Defense Accords, and it was a treaty that would require coalition members to defend each other against unprovoked aggression, and many species were hesitant because they feared it would draw them into conflicts. But Kyle argued that unity was the only defense against empires like the Krell, and slowly support grew, and species on the Krell borders were especially enthusiastic because they had lived in fear for decades, and now they saw a chance to stand together against their oppressor. Admiral Berkeley's fleet continued its advance, and more human warships joined her every week, as new vessels completed construction, and volunteers from the liberated worlds also joined, and the fleet became a true coalition force, and humanity had gone from standing alone to leading an alliance, and the fleet numbered over 100 ships now, and they were approaching the Krell home system, and every human on every ship knew what was coming next, and they were going to attack the Krell homeworld, and they were going to end this war forever on Earth. Jenny Morrison finally took a break from rescue operations, and she had worked for 6 weeks straight and pulled hundreds of people from the ruins, and she attended a memorial service for the 15 million who died in the first attack, and she stood with thousands of others and listened as President Cooper spoke, and he promised that their deaths would not be in vain, and that humanity would build a better galaxy from the ashes of this war. And Jenny looked up at the night sky, and knew that somewhere out there Admiral Berkeley was carrying the fight to the enemy, and she whispered a prayer for all the brave souls who were fighting for humanity's future. The fleet gathered at the edge of the Krell home system, and Admiral Berkeley broadcast a message to her forces, and she told them that what they did in the next days would echo through history, and she told them that they fought not for conquest, but for justice, and she told them that every human who had died deserved to be avenged, and she told them that the Krell had come to Earth seeking to The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Krell home system, and the stars were different here, and the local sun burned with a harsh yellow light, and in the center of the system was Krell Prime, and it was a world of red deserts and black oceans, and it had been the heart of an empire that had terrorized this region of space for generations, and now that empire was about to fall, and Admiral Lisa Berkeley stood on the bridge of her flagship Defiance and watched the tactical displays and counted over 300 Krell warships waiting to defend their homeworld, and it was the last major concentration of their military power, and she knew this battle would decide everything. Dr. Alan Rivers was aboard the Defiance, and he had come to oversee the deployment of his final innovation, and it was called the Harbinger Cannon, and it fired concentrated bursts of exotic matter that could pierce any known shield technology. And the prototype was mounted on the flagship, and it had never been tested in combat. But the simulations were promising, and Rivers checked the systems one more time, and everything was ready, and he looked at the Krell fleet through the viewing screen and felt no pity because they had started this war, and now humanity would finish it. On Krell Prime, the High Council met an emergency session, and Supreme Leader Krath stood at the head of the chamber, and his scales were dark with age and rage, and he refused to consider surrender, and he called it weakness and cowardice, and he said the Krell Empire would never bow to inferior species, and several council members argued with him, and they had seen the reports of human victories, and they knew the war was lost. But Krath would not listen, and he ordered them silent, and commanded the fleet to attack and destroy the humans, and the council members who disagreed said nothing more, but they began making secret plans to save themselves, because they knew Krath was leading their species to destruction. Admiral Berkeley opened a communication channel to the Krell homeworld, and her face appeared on screens across the planet, and she spoke in clear, measured tones, and she said that the Krell Empire had come to Earth seeking conquest, and had brought death to millions of innocents, and now humanity offered them a choice, and they could surrender unconditionally and stand trial for their war crimes, or they could share the fate they had intended for Earth, and she gave them 1 hour to respond, and then closed the channel and waited. Supreme Leader Krath responded within minutes, and his image filled human screens, and his reptilian features twisted with hatred, and he spat his words, and said that the Krell would never surrender to mammals, and that human victory was impossible, and that the Empire would endure forever, and he ordered his fleet to attack and promised that every human would die screaming, and Admiral Berkeley listened to his threats, and felt nothing but determination, and she gave the order to engage, and the final battle of the war began. The space around Krell Prime lit up with weapons fire, and ships from both sides accelerated toward each other, and the Krell had numbers, but the humans had technology and tactics, and Captain Rachel Ford led the fighter wings in surgical strikes against Krell command ships, and her pilots moved like dancers, and the neural command network gave them reaction times that seemed supernatural, and they destroyed communication relays and command vessels, and within the first hour the Krell fleet command structure was in chaos, and individual ship captains had to make their own decisions without coordination. Captain Nicole Davis and the Indomitable anchored the human battle line, and her graviton lance carved through enemy formations and created artificial gravity wells that crushed multiple ships at once, and Krell warships tried to target her vessel. But the human point defense systems were too good, and incoming fire was intercepted and destroyed, and Nicole's crew worked with practiced efficiency, and they had trained for months, and every person knew their role perfectly, and the Indomitable became death itself, and Krell captains learned to fear the sight of her ship. Vice Admiral Chris Hammond led his quick strike group in a series of micro-jumps, and they appeared above Krell Prime's orbital shipyards and opened fire before the defenders could react, and the shipyards exploded in massive fireballs, and thousands of partially built warships were destroyed before they could launch. And Hammond's group jumped again and appeared at the orbital weapons platforms and destroyed them systematically, and the Krell had no time to coordinate a defense because the human ships were simply too fast and too unpredictable. On the ground, Major Kevin Brooks led 5,000 Marines in a daring orbital insertion, and their drop pods screamed through the atmosphere and landed in the capital city of the Krell homeworld, and the objective was to capture Supreme Leader. Krath and the High Council in the urban combat was fierce and brutal, and Krell soldiers fought desperately to defend their leaders, but human Marines had powered armor that made them stronger and faster, and they had weapons that could punch through, building walls, and they advanced block by block through the city. A Krell super dreadnought broke through the human lines, and it was massive and heavily armored, and it began moving toward the Defiance, and its weapons could potentially destroy the flagship. And Admiral Berkeley watched it approach and asked Dr. Rivers if the Harbinger cannon was ready. And Rivers said yes, and Berkeley gave the order to fire, and the exotic matter beam lanced out and struck the super dreadnought, and the enemy shields meant nothing, and the beam cut through the massive vessel like it was paper, and the ship split in two, and both halves exploded and debris scattered across space. And the psychological impact on the Krell fleet was devastating, because their most powerful ship had been destroyed in seconds. The battle raged for 8 hours, and slowly the Krell fleet was ground down, and human ships worked in coordinated groups, and they isolated enemy vessels and destroyed them one by one, and the Krell fought bravely, but they were outmatched, and their casualties mounted, and finally their formation broke and individual ships tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. And Admiral Berkeley's fleet had surrounded the planet, and every escape route was blocked. And the Krell home defense fleet was annihilated, and human warships took up orbital positions over Krell Prime, and their weapons were trained on the surface, and Berkeley broadcast another demand for surrender. Major Brooks and his Marines fought their way to the High Council chambers, and the building was heavily defended, and the fighting was room to room and corridor to corridor, and human soldiers used breaching charges to blow through walls and clear rooms with grenades and gunfire, and Krell guards fought to the death. But they could not stop the Marine advance, and Brooks reached the main chamber and found chaos, and several council members had already fled through secret passages while others had taken their own lives rather than face capture. And Supreme Leader Krath stood in the throne room with a ceremonial blade in his clawed hand. Krath refused to surrender, and he screamed defiance and charged at the Marines, and Brooks tried to order him to stop. But the Krell leader would not listen, and he attacked. And the Marines had no choice, and they opened fire, and Krath fell and died on the floor of his throne room, and his blood pooled on the ancient stones, and the Krell Empire died with him, and the remaining government officials surrendered, and the war was over. President Daniel Cooper arrived at Krell Prime 3 days later aboard the diplomatic vessel New Dawn, and the ceremony was broadcast across the galaxy, and the remaining Krell leadership formally surrendered and signed the peace treaty, and the terms were harsh but fair, and the Krell military would be dismantled, and war criminals would face justice, and the species they had conquered would be freed, and Krell Prime would be occupied by peacekeeping forces until a new government could be established, and the Krell representatives signed with shaking hands because they had no choice. The Galactic Coalition sent representatives to the ceremony, and they rushed to be part of the peace process, and they wanted to claim credit for the victory, but Ambassador Kyle Martinez reminded them coldly that they had done nothing to help during the war, and he said that humanity remembered who stood with them and who abandoned them, and his words made many species uncomfortable, but they could not deny the truth, and the coalition's credibility was damaged, and reforms would be necessary. Admiral Berkeley stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked down at Krell Prime, and the planet that had been the seat of an empire was now defeated and occupied, And she thought about the millions of humans who had died to reach this moment. And she wondered what humanity had become. And they had been forced to embrace warfare and develop terrible weapons and become warriors when they had wanted to be explorers and scientists. And she worried that the cost of victory might be too high, and that humanity might lose its soul in the process of defending its body. Captain Ford was awarded the Solar Cross, and it was humanity's highest military honor, and she received it from President Cooper himself, and thousands attended the ceremony, and she stood at attention while the president pinned the medal to her uniform. And when he finished, she saluted, and her eyes were wet with tears because she was thinking of all the pilots who had not survived to see this day. And Vice Admiral Hammond was promoted to full admiral, and Captain Davis became the youngest flag officer in human history, and Major Brooks was given command of the peacekeeping forces on Krell Prime. Doc. 6 months passed, and the galaxy had been transformed by the war, and Earth rose from its ashes, and the destroyed cities were rebuilt, and they were more beautiful than before, and they stood as monuments to human resilience and determination, and memorials honored the 15 million who died in the initial attack, and the 100,000 who fell in the campaign that followed, and people visited these memorials every day, and placed flowers and said prayers and promised that those who died would never be forgotten. And humanity had survived the worst attack in its history and emerged stronger. The Krell Empire was dissolved, and its former territory was divided into independent states, and Colonel Kevin Brooks commanded the peacekeeping force on Krell Prime, and his soldiers maintained order, while the Krell people struggled to adapt to their new reality, and many older Krell could not accept their defeat, and they clung to dreams of imperial glory and caused problems. But younger Krell were different, and they were tired of war and conquest, and they wanted to build something new and better, and slowly a new Krell identity was emerging. A young Krell named Sarn became a symbol of this change, and he had been a soldier during the war, but now he worked with Colonel Brooks to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the commission would acknowledge Krell crimes and provide a path forward, and Sarn spoke publicly about the atrocities his species had committed, and many Krell hated him for it, but others admired his courage, and the commission began hearing testimony from victims and from Krell soldiers, and the process was painful but necessary, and Brooks and Sarn became friends, and their friendship showed that even the deepest hatreds could heal. The species freed from Krell oppression formed the Free Worlds Alliance, and they had strong ties to humanity, and they were grateful for their liberation, and they wanted to ensure it never happened again, and the Viridian Republic had stood with humanity during the war. And now they were Earth's closest partners, and together, humans and Viridians pushed for reforms within the Galactic Coalition, and the old policies of non-interference were being questioned and debated. Ambassador Kyle Martinez's proposal for the Mutual Defense Accords gained overwhelming support, and at a historic session of the Galactic Coalition, the treaty was ratified, and species who had once cowered in fear now stood together, and the accords meant that an attack on one member would be met by the combined might of all. And President Daniel Cooper attended the ceremony on the Coalition capital world of Zenith Prime, and he delivered a speech that became famous across the galaxy. Cooper stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled ambassadors, and he spoke clearly, and his words were translated into 1,000 languages, and he said that humanity had not sought war and had not wanted to become warriors, but when faced with extinction they had shown what they were truly capable of. And he said that now humanity offered that same strength in defense of all who sought peace and justice, and he said that the galaxy had learned a hard lesson, and that tyranny would never again go unchallenged, and the speech received standing ovations from 2/3 of the coalition members, and the remaining third found themselves increasingly isolated. Admiral Lisa Berkeley retired from active service, and she had become the most celebrated military commander in human history, and songs were written about her, and children played games pretending to be her, but she wanted only peace, and she returned to her family's ranch in Montana. And the wide open spaces and quiet nights were a welcome change from the bridge of a warship, and she accepted a position as advisor to the Coalition's new Joint Military Command. But she did the work from home, and spent most of her time with her family, and tried to forget the terrible things she had seen. In her final address to the fleet, Berkeley stood before thousands of sailors, and her uniform was crisp and her medals gleamed, and she told them that they had fought not because they loved war, but because they loved what they were defending, and she said that distinction was critical, and she said that the moment they fought for conquest rather than protection, they would become no better than those they had defeated, and her words were recorded and became required study at military academies. And every officer learned to understand the difference between defense and aggression. Captain Rachel Ford was given command of the newly commissioned carrier Vengeance, and it was named in honor of those who had fallen. And it was the largest warship humanity had ever built, and its fighter complement could destroy entire fleets. And Rachel stood on its bridge and felt the weight of responsibility, because this ship represented humanity's commitment to defending the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. And Admiral Chris Hammond became commander of the First Fleet, and it was permanently stationed to defend Coalition space, and Captain Nicole Davis led the research division and developed the next generation of defensive technologies. On Earth, Colonel Peter Grant's Civilian Defense Corps became a permanent institution, and every human learned basic combat and survival skills, and the training was not militaristic, but practical, and people knew how to defend their homes and organize evacuations and use emergency equipment, and humanity would never again be caught unprepared. And President Cooper was careful to maintain civilian control of the military because he was wary of becoming a militaristic society, and democracy remained strong, and the balance between security and freedom was carefully maintained. Dr. Alan Rivers faced difficult decisions, and the weapons his team had developed were now sought by numerous coalition species, and some people argued that humanity should sell the technology because it would generate revenue for reconstruction and help cement political alliances, but Rivers argued passionately against it, and he warned that spreading such destructive power could lead to a galactic arms race, and he said that humanity had a moral responsibility to control what they had created, and the debate was fierce, but ultimately a compromise was reached. The coalition established the Joint Defense Technology Bureau, and it would develop weapons cooperatively, while preventing any single species from gaining dominance, and Dr. Rivers was appointed its first director, and scientists from 20 different species served under him, and they worked together to create defensive systems that would protect all coalition members without giving anyone an overwhelming advantage, and the Bureau became a model for cooperation and trust building, and it helped heal the divisions caused by the war. The most difficult issue facing the post-war galaxy was what to do about the Krell people, and war crimes trials continued on Krell Prime, and thousands of former military officers faced justice, and many were convicted and imprisoned. But millions of ordinary Krell had simply followed their leaders' orders, and punishing them seemed unjust, and the question divided public opinion, and some humans wanted harsh punishment while others advocated mercy and forgiveness, and the debate was emotional and complicated. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Sarn and Colonel Brooks established became the solution, and it allowed Krell to acknowledge their crimes and seek forgiveness, and it gave victims a chance to tell their stories and be heard, and the process was painful and slow, but it worked, and gradually the hatred began to fade. And Sarn gave a speech that was broadcast across the galaxy, and he said that his species had been taught that conquest was glorious, and that other species were inferior. But now he understood that these teachings were lies, and he said that young Krell wanted to build a different future, and he asked for a chance to prove that they had changed. Jenny Morrison stood in New York at the dedication ceremony for the memorial to the fallen, and the structure was massive and beautiful, and 15 million names were inscribed on its walls, and each name represented a life and a family and a future that had been stolen, and Jenny had pulled hundreds of people from the ruins, but she knew that millions more had not been saved, and she touched the wall and found the names of friends and neighbors and wept. And President Cooper spoke at the ceremony, and he said that those who died had not died in vain, and that humanity had built a better galaxy from the ashes of tragedy. On Vex Prime, the liberated aliens celebrated their first free elections, and it was a moment of pure joy, and Major Kevin Brooks attended as an honored guest, and the alien species had lived in chains for 20 years under Krell occupation, and now they were free, and they chose their own leaders and made their own laws, and they looked at Brooks and the other humans with gratitude and wonder, and they called humanity the Liberators, and Brooks felt proud, but also humble, because he knew the victory had cost too much. On Zenith Prime, Ambassador Martinez and President Cooper negotiated the terms of Earth's expanded role in the coalition, and humanity was no longer a junior member, but a leading voice, and they had earned that position through sacrifice and courage. And Martinez was appointed to the Coalition Security Council, and he would help shape galactic policy for years to come, and Earth became one of the major powers in the galaxy, and the species that had once dismissed humans as weak newcomers now treated them with respect and sometimes fear. On the frontier, Admiral Hammond's fleet patrolled the borders of Coalition space, and they were a deterrent to any species that might consider aggression. And the message was clear, and the galaxy had changed, and humanity stood ready to defend the peace they had fought so hard to achieve.